Okay, class, welcome back. This is part 2 of lecture 2, Context for the Birth of the Black Church. In our first video, we were rudely interrupted by issues of technology, and so we're going to go ahead and get through this. And just a word of warning, I am at my daytime job at my high school, so you may hear some announcements, but we're going to work through that because the information is important enough to work through whatever bugs may come our way. Like I said, we're dealing with the birth of the black church, the context for the birth of the black church, and before we move forward, because we left off talking about the middle passage, before we move forward I want to go backwards, because in that first video I mentioned how when African people were enslaved, brought here to the Americas for a long period, some scholars say almost up to 100 years, black people were kept out of the church. Reason being, some folk viewed black people as less than human, subhuman, having no souls, and thus bringing them to church was considered a waste of time. There were others who kept African people out of the church for different reasons. There were some who believed that if blacks were exposed to the gospel and accepted the gospel, then they would be required to treat them as equals, as brothers and sisters in Christ, and that would mess up the enslaver-enslaved relationship. And so for that reason, they just kept them out of the church. And still others did not want blacks exposed to the Bible because, one, it would give them an opportunity to read scriptures for themselves and be exposed to what some folk viewed as the liberating message of the Bible, especially those Old Testament stories. In fact, the entire Old Testament is really just the same story told over and over and over again. God's people in trouble, calling upon God for help, for salvation, for deliverance out of oppression, and God responding, giving them the help that they need, whether that be a leader, whether that be miracles, whether that be blessing their efforts. But over and over again throughout the Old Testament, the story is the same. God supporting those people who are seeking to end their oppression, end their enslavement, and find freedom. And so for that reason, there were several people who did not want enslaved Africans exposed to such a liberating message. However, with so many people viewing African people as subhuman, or at least convincing themselves in their minds that they were subhuman, less than human, they believed that they could domesticate African people, that reduce them to your pet, to fetch when they said fetch, to sit when they said sit, to run, walk when you said run or walk. And so they believed that African people could be domesticated, just like wild animals are domesticated and the fight is taken out of them, where they are totally obedient to the person who has done the domesticating. Enslavers, many enslavers believed they could achieve those same ends with African people. And what they found out was that wasn't true, because there was always resistance, whether that resistance was in large groups organizing revolts, or whether it was smaller groups doing the same thing, or even when it was individuals with their individual acts of defiance, whether that be breaking tools, whether that be work slowdowns, or whether that be the people who were doing, excusing the cooking for Massa, grinding up glass and putting it in his meal and watching him slowly die a slow and painful death from that. But there was always, and let me underscore, always resistance. I probably said that last video. I'll probably say that in every video. Always resistance, because you had human beings that recognized that they were being treated less than human beings and felt that it was their divine duty to stand up and fight against such ill treatment. With all that being said, and I don't remember if I said this in the last video or not, so please forgive me, but there was that the example of Haiti, the example when enslavers kidnapped African people and they brought them to the Americas. They took great pains to separate peoples, those who could communicate with one another. So they were trying to break up languages, trying to break up customs, trying to break up beliefs and national ties, so that there would be no unifying force, that we wouldn't know each other, wouldn't be able to unify. Well, there was at one time when they made the mistake of capturing an entire village and transporting that village almost intact from Africa to the Americas, and they brought them to Haiti. And so there in Haiti, you had a group of people who had all of their customs, all of their values, all their beliefs, all their family and community connections. And what the Africans, what they said, God crossed the water with us. And so with all that, you had a group of people who were praying to their God for healing and strength and for the courage to stand up and end this madness, this atrocity that was being inflicted upon their people. And so Toussaint Louverture and Dessalines led the Haitian people, but it was a group effort to end their oppression, and they were the first ones, the first revolt of the enslaved to be successful and win their freedom in the Western Hemisphere. And well, two things about that. One, Haiti has been paying the price to this very day. Haiti, they were so strong, Toussaint Louverture and his troops were so strong that they took on the three greatest powers in the world at that time, the French army, the British army, and I think the Spanish army, and they defeated all of them. The second thing about that is Haiti has been paying a price ever since. They've had to pay reparations to almost all of those countries for having the audacity to want to be free, and not only want to be free, but earn their freedom. And the country of France made the country of Haiti pay for the wages they lost because they lost a slave colony, or a colony of the enslaved. Madness, I know, but anyway. But the point being, there was always insurrections, always people, even though African people were being treated like they were less than human, told they weren't worth anything, and people believed that they were subhuman, had no consciousness or whatever. It always shone through in their desire for freedom. And so they always fought. And so it was at this point when I believe it was the National Missionary Society said, well, let us introduce the Christian faith to these African people, and maybe that will provide the vehicle by which we can control this people who, to this point, we have not been able to control, because there's been insurrection after insurrection after revolt after revolt. And so the National Missionary Society created Bible study programs and religious tracts and Bible lessons, all teaching Christianity from the perspective of the enslaver and the enslaved. And so the message was, slave, be obedient to your master. The message was, it is your duty, your divine duty, to work hard and to never, ever daddle, or to, I don't even know the word I'm looking for, to never ever slack off, to always be working hard, even if no one's looking. You are working hard for your master, because your master represents God on earth. And so that whole notion of slave, be obedient to your master, you're not only being obedient to your master, through obedience to your master, you are showing obedience and submission to Almighty God. And so this was the message over and over again. And another message was, if you see someone who is slacking off, who is sinning, not working for massa, which was a sin, If you see someone who is not working and giving their all, 100 and 110%, to do the master's bidding, it is your divine duty to tell on them. And if you don't, you are in sin. And so you may have to work hard. You may catch hell during your time on earth, but don't worry. You will receive your reward after you die. Now, Massa was not following that religion at all. Massa was working to build his kingdom here on earth the entire time. But that is what those who were in power were teaching to their enslaved. And it's amazing how that message is still holds weight and is still being taught in so many churches. Another thing about what the message that enslaved Africans were receiving on the plantation, and it goes to the whole argument that people were having in terms of should we expose blacks to the Bible or not. Well, you had, this is a quote from the Negro Church in America, page 18. Some masters became convinced that some of the best slaves, that is, those amenable to control by their white masters, were those who read the Bible. And so they were taught that God expected black men and women to accept their lot in this life, and if they were obedient and honest and truthful, they would be rewarded in the world after death. They were taught that obedience to master was equal to obedience to God. That's from page 19 of the same book. So there were those who were opposed to exposing Africans to the Bible for the reasons mentioned, but there were others who said, we find great evidence that the Bible, especially the New Testament stories in the New Testament, or the message of the New Testament, we find all sorts of things that are amenable to our beliefs, to our belief that we should be in power and they should be enslaved. And so Africans who were enslaved were fed a heavy dose of the New Testament. And why that is still relevant today, because if you walk into 99.9% of black churches in 2015, they get the vast majority of their teachings, the vast majority of their focus, the vast majority of their sermons are coming out of the very same New Testament, with a whole lot of the same theology that was being taught during our enslavement. So I just wanted to go backwards and share that when we're talking about the black experience in the white church, etc. But to get back to the issue at hand, last time we were together, we were talking about context for the birth of the black church. We were talking about we were talking about enslavement, that whole issue of enslavement, trying to set up this idea in our heads, or to get an understanding of why black people needed the black church. And when we're doing this, because last video I was talking about, okay, when was the black church born? Some people say in ancient Africa. Some people say when black folk were free and could control it ourselves. Other people say it was during our enslavement, at one point or another, during our enslavement, when blacks first went into the church, or during our enslavement when blacks went into the church and then snuck out the back door into the swamps, into the forest, and had our own worship services. So there are many different answers if I ask you that question on a midterm, when was the black church born, or for a paper if you want to use that as your topic. There are many different ways that you can go, but if your focus is the black church was born during enslavement, then what was going on in black folks' minds, bodies, and spirits that would make them need such an institution? And so we talked about the enslavement being several different layers of traumatic experience upon traumatic experience upon traumatic experience. The first being the capture we talked about last time, and then the trek to the dungeons. And each one of those, hundreds of thousands of African lives lost. And then we went on to the Middle Passage, packed in the bowels of ships like sardines, using the bathroom on one another, death all around them, from disease, from starvation, from murder, from suicide, with men and women oftentimes women with their children, choosing to jump overboard. And I told you about how the sharks knew that they were going to get a meal. So when these ships of the enslaved took off, there were always like this big trail of sharks following behind because they knew they were going to eat well. We talked about the enslavers knowing that they were going to lose 20 to 40% of their cargo. So some chose to do what they called a tight pack. They would fit as many people as possible in, knowing that they were going to lose 20 to 40%. And when I say lose, I mean people dying and not being able to have their mind, bodies, and spirits raped for profit for others. So pack as many as you can, knowing you're going to lose 20 to 40%. So at the end of the day, I'll have enough to make profit. Others chose to do what they call the loose pack, thinking that the looser the pack, the fewer will die, and thus I will increase my profits on the other end. But whether it was a tight pack or a loose pack, you're talking about the voyage taking 6 to 8 weeks, and depending on the scholar, like I had mentioned before, anywhere between 9 and 100 million African human beings died just in that stage alone, the Middle Passage. And if you were fortunate enough to survive that, then you made it to the seasoning farms. The seasoning farms were located in the islands. And operant conditioning was used to transform a united people, a people who throughout their entire existence grew up with this notion of I am because we are. We are, therefore I am. We can do more together than we can apart. A people with a communal atmosphere. Let's work together. Let's work together. So operant conditioning was used to try to tear that down. And I think it was John O'Killen said, the process for turning a human being into a slave is to convince them to look out only for themselves, not look out for the interests of their group, their community, their people. And if you can do that, you can have a minority in control of larger numbers because everyone over here is just thinking about themselves, not realizing that if they come together, they can change their situation. But operant conditioning, for any of you psychologists out there, y'all know what that is. You reward behavior that you want, and you punish behavior that you don't want. And even if you're not a psychologist, if you have a pet, it's the same process. You reward the behavior you want, you punish the behavior that you don't want. And that's exactly what happened on the seasoning farms, because the human beings were being seasoned, were being conditioned to be transformed from a human being to someone who would accept enslavement. And so if someone stepped out of line, if an African looked a white person directly in the eye, if they didn't follow an order or didn't do it fast enough, if they didn't work hard enough, they were brutally beaten, sometimes castrated, sometimes mutilated, any number of punishments. But the punishment was always done in front of everyone. They weren't taken off to the side and punished. They were punished in front of everyone because a message was being sent. If you have the audacity to stand up and try to live out some full humanity, or think that you're fully human, or talk back, or do anything, if you do anything that does not show total obedience to those who are in charge, this is what happens. And so not only is the person that's getting the hell beat out of them being conditioned, everybody that's standing around watching is being conditioned, and they know what to do and what not to do. And that's the whole issue of the seasoning farms, trying to get people ready and psychologically in a position where they would accept their enslavement because they know what they're supposed to do and they know what they're not supposed to do. And doing what you're not supposed to do could lead to brutal beatings, rape, castration, mutilation, and even death. And if you survived all that nonsense and madness, then you made it to the auction block, where you were treated worse than animals, or you're standing up there naked or darn near naked, where they're lotioning up or oiling up your body so that you can be presented in the best way possible. You know, just like a car is washed and shined before people try to sell it, where those who are doing the purchasing inspect human beings like they would inspect animals, checking the teeth and checking a little bit of everything else. The auction block is where many families were separated. Husband sold this way, wife sold the other, parents sold this way, children sold down the river that way. That's where that phrase comes, sold down the river. It comes from the auction block. And then there was this issue of the enslaved being capped or plugged. After surviving the Middle Passage and seasoning farms, those who survived, many were still very, very sick. And so those who suffered from diarrhea, enslavers figured them standing up there on the auction block experiencing their medical issues would not lend itself to a sale. And so they began this practice of capping or plugging African people. They came up with some mixture, and I can't remember what they used, but they would actually stick it up the anus of one of the enslaved who happened to be sick, so that when they were on the auction block at least, you could not tell that they had this issue of diarrhea. And there's no telling what kind of medical horrors that practice brought on, but that was a part of the auction block experience. And if you survive that traumatic experience, like I was saying, each experience is just a nightmare and trauma upon itself. If you survive that, you made it to plantation life, where you worked for someone else from sunup to sundown, where all of your labor is used for the benefit of someone else. You're building up someone else's wealth to the detriment of your own. They are becoming rich because you are being kept poor, because you have no time to build up your own industry, or no opportunity. Even if you do, you are beaten down for that. Doing the master's bidding, beaten and tortured for hanging on to your old ways and customs, not allowed to use your language. Too many blacks gathered together at any one time, if they weren't working, was outlawed and prohibited, just like today. Fighting back, of course, was prohibited, and you were punished by brutal beatings or death. The drum was outlawed, and the drum for African people was far more than a musical instrument. The drum represented a spiritual reality, and it always hearkened in African people an awareness of a power greater than themselves. So the drum was far more than music. It was far more than entertainment. It was far more than just some cultural expression. It was a religious instrument and tool to keep African people reminded that we are part of the universe, the one song that is all that God has created. And so taking away that was a part of plantation life, just trying to remove all the things that made African people human, so that they would believe themselves to be less than human and then act accordingly. And then on plantation life, the story that's probably not told enough, a sickening story of all the folk who were raped. And it wasn't just women who were raped by Massa and those Massa allowed to have their way with these African people. Women and men raped, and husbands, fathers, brothers, unable to protect and defend and provide for those that they loved, was just a whole different level of abuse in plantation life. And so it's important that we understand that I know that talking about this and thinking about it rationally and intellectually is one thing. There's absolutely no way that in a class, whether face-to-face or online, we can do justice to the horrors that this was. but suffice it to say the world of the African was turned completely upside down. And so you're talking about a people, we're dealing with a people who've suffered massive, massive trauma with no relief in sight. Nearly everything that fueled and strengthened their beliefs have been stripped from them. And, you know, we can look to the European Jews who experienced their Holocaust, those who actually experienced it, and even those who did not, like their offspring, to this day seeking psychological treatment because they are aware that any prolonged period of powerlessness and oppression has severe psychological ramifications on you. And not just you, but on anyone who is a part of your line. That's why people who were not in the German concentration camps, but their children and their children's children, even to this day, are still seeking psychological healing because they believe that psychological damage done to their people at any time still impacts them to this very day. And prolonged periods of powerlessness affect your self-image, the way you treat your own people, the way you treat yourself, and what you allow people to do to you, your level of trust and respect for your own people. All that is damaged when you suffer a prolonged period of powerlessness, oppression, enslavement, and that prolonged period could be as short as a few days or a few weeks. So imagine it being months, years, a lifetime, generations. We're talking about incredible trauma. The world of the African was turned upside down. And so their Holocaust, well, you know, the Jewish Holocaust lasted some years, and there's an estimated 6 million people who lost their lives. The African Holocaust started at the very least around 1600, and some people argue it's still going on to this very day. But even if you give it an endpoint at the 1800s or 1865, which would not be fair to that period right after that, 1865 all the way to the beginning of World War II, which some people argue was black people were treated even worse than they were during their enslavement. But anyway, the African Holocaust costing over 100 million lives. European Jews have recognized that if they're going to be a people able to have relationships and able to move forward in a positive way, they needed psychological healing. African people, when they were going through this, they recognized that they needed some level of healing too. They needed something because their world, like I said, their world had been turned upside down as a result of their experiences. They needed stability. They needed comfort, relationships, healing, hope, symbols of the divine, reassurance that God is still with them, God on their side, and a constant word of uplift and encouragement. So the point is, they needed a spiritual institution to provide them with these things, especially hope to hold on to, because a human being who is alive but has no hope is really the walking dead. Hope is the thing that keeps people moving forward, even in tough times, in difficult, almost impossible situations, believing that one day things are going to be better, if not for me, for my children, or for my children's children. And so it was out of this need for stability, comfort, relationships, all these things, that a church was born, a fellowship where we could find comfort, where we could be treated like dogs all week long, but we could find respect, where we could be a deacon, where we could be a mother of the church, where we could exercise control, at least on some level, control of our own thing, at least on that day, in that moment, where we could find some semblance of healing, even if it was a message that we may not get anything on this side of the grave, but at some point, in that great getting up morning, at some point we are going to walk across heaven and receive our milk and honey, our wings, everything else. But it was this hope. It was this hope, whether it was hope in freedom one day or hope that after I die, I'm going to have a better life. But it was the hope that allowed African people to survive what many people consider an unsurvivable situation and reality. Hope, symbols of the divine, a reminder that, you know, no matter what the world says or how you're treated, there is a God that sees you and that loves you. These were messages that African people needed. Relationships, people who community was so important for. They needed the opportunity to come together and fellowship. Was such an important point. So the black church, even the biggest critics of the black church, and its theology and direction, they all recognize that without the black church, black people probably would have died during enslavement, and we would be no more. So the black church is just that important. I'm going to try to finish this up quickly. We're talking about two groups of people, though, getting back to the issue of theology. A reminder, theology is really answering those four questions: what you believe about God, humanity, salvation, and the role of religion / the church. Where you have an African people who believe one way, a European people who believed another, and when they came together in this peculiar institution, as Kenneth Stamp says in his classic book, you had a clash of theologies. And that clash played itself out, of course, more so with black folk, because we were being taught someone else's theology rather than us teaching them ours. Quick review: African people, God is a force and energy, not a material being. God of love, harmony, unity, fairness, but also justice. In many ways, black folk were pantheistic. God was in everyone and in everything. But we are also monotheistic. Even though we saw God in the river, the tree, in you and in me, we still recognize that there was one God. God was energy. God was a force. God was close. God was not far off, but God was right here. God was very accessible, and God's power was accessible. That's why for African people, it was personal experience more so than quoting scriptures that was most important. How is God touching you? Don't just read someone's holy book, whether it's called the Bible or the Quran or whatever. Don't just sit there and read about how God did wonders for someone else. What did God do for you? You. Okay. So that's what African people believe about God. About humanity, we're created out of God, out of the substance of God, inherently good, yet capable of sin, created for community and for connection. Created to serve God. That's our purpose, serving God. Born with a purpose and born with inherent value. You don't get your value because of your title, because of what side of town you're on, because of how much money you have or how big your rims are. You have value because God placed it in you